Everyone, and welcome to the Cities in the History series. Before I welcome with great delight my friend and colleague to speak, I just have a very few brief announcements to make. It is with great pleasure I invite Dr. Partho Datta, who will be speaking to us today in the Cities in History series. On urban planning in colonial India, some themes and perspectives. I was asking Partho before we came what else I could say about him, and he doesn't want me to, so I'll just say that he teaches in Zakir Husain College, University of Delhi. He's been a fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and has published, amongst many other things, more recently, Planning the City, Urbanization and Reform in Calcutta, 1800 to 1940, which came out with Tulika in 2012. So, with great pleasure, Partho, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Malvika. I was feeling very nervous in the morning, but it's nice to have a friend chair this session. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stand and speak because I'm going to show some slides, and I thought just in case I need to point out some of the things there. Okay, so let me just say that when I began working on the planning of the planning history of India many years ago, I started doing a PhD 20 years ago on the history of colonial planning and Calcutta. The literature on it was rather sparse, and there were not many people who had actually worked on it. And now when I look back on it, all the great names, the great planning historians, let me just tell you a couple of names. So, for instance, the historian Norma Evanson, who has a book on the Indian city, but nobody ever seems to read it. I don't know why. Then there is the great French urbanist François Choët. Again, nobody seems to. These names don't resonate. Then I discovered Spyro Kostoff, the great architectural historian, but nobody reads him either. And then there is, of course, Ira Katznelson. Ira Katznelson is better known because he's a labor historian, but he also writes on cities and planning. And some of those things, somehow, for whatever reasons, Indian historians haven't really taken to planning history at all. So what I'm going to do in this talk, it's going to be a very, very general talk. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask some questions. So what do planning historians really do? What are their concerns? Where are their overlaps with other disciplines? And what is the nature of this archive, the planning archive? What kind of material do we get? Very briefly. And most importantly, what are the models of planning? I mean, we need to study that. Most histories of planning really look at the various models which were developed for cities. Most of the examples, I'll be eclectic, but most of the examples are from Calcutta because that's the city I know best. I know the historical archive best there. Let me begin with some gut reactions to planning history. Again, 20 years ago, when I was young, foolish, and arrogant, and wanted to do great research, so when I told people that I was working on the planning history, I was working on Calcutta and planning, the first response would usually be, "You must be joking." Let's have the first slide, please. Look at this picture. I hope it's clear. This is from the early 20th century. This is just off. This is called Canning Street. You can see the Jewish synagogue there. It's a very important heart of Calcutta. It's completely crowded. The British had a name for this. This is from a planning report from the early 20th century. They called it Calcutta constipation. Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of Chowrungi, which is Chowrungi Road, which is how do I put it? It's the Connaught Place of Calcutta. 1980s. Just look at it, the chaos of billboards and And I believe Mamta. I just recently came back from Calcutta. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to Chowrungi, but I believe Mamta Didi has stopped this visual confusion. She's actually stopped this thing. Anyway, there is chaos. Now I sympathize actually when people say, what's planning got to do with all this and the city anyway? So I hope to answer some of that question. Anyway, my second thing was that I would trot up to academics and tell them that I'm working on planning. And I'm talking of 20 years ago, of course. And the usual response would be from them would be silence. And they would say, And then I could see the hard disk of the mind doing a quick search. And the response would be, oh, Mohenjo-daro. And I would be quite indignant, because one thing I knew for sure, I would say, but I don't work on ancient India, I work on modern India, I work on colonial India, and Mohenjo-daro has nothing to do with this. I knew that for sure. I wasn't very sure where I was going at that point, because the simple fact is that the British, when they started restructuring and building Indian cities, had no interest in the cities that they knew. Certainly in the early 19th century, they didn't even know about Mohenjo-daro or Harappa or whatever. And let me just give you an example. When in Calcutta they were restructuring and building parts of Calcutta in the early 19th century, they started building roads and they started building squares. Let's have the next slide, please. The next one. Yeah, this one. They started building. This is actually Dalhousie Square. I don't know whether you can recognize. This is from the early 90s. So beautiful. It's from this picture is from the church there. I'll come back to that church again, St. Andrew's Church. This is Writers' Building on the side. And I knew, and what they wanted to do is when they built the square, they of course wanted to put a fountain in the middle. And you know what they said? They said, let's get all the marble from the Agra palaces. They actually wanted to destroy parts of the Taj and the Agra fort and bring it down to Calcutta to build this city. So they had no loyalty to Indian cities. So there is no question of going back to past models of planning as far as Indian cities, as far as the modern city was concerned. Let's go to the previous slide. But you know, now I think about it and I say that why is always there is this gut reaction about Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, usually Harappan civilization. Just look at this thing. This is of course an imaginary view of what Mohenjo-daro would have looked like. The picture that we usually see is one of an archaeological dig which has trenches and neatly laid out roads. But this is an imaginary, this is done by an artist. This is from actually A.L. Basham's book, the famous Wonder That Was India. And he has taken it from Percy Brown's book. I later checked and found out. This is the Great Bath, and this is the granary and so on, so the mound and so on and so forth. But look at it carefully. What does it really tell us? And it's basically ordered urban space. And if you ask me the first question, what is planning? Then a very, very simple question, the answer would be that planning is nothing but ordering urban spaces. So that's my first point. But then it really begs the question that if planning is ordered urban spaces, then what is modern urban planning? What is modern about planning? That is what we really need to answer. That's what I wanted to answer myself. And here I'm giving you a very tentative view, which I have, which is that, and here I will just now give you a small example from contemporary history. In 1996, I was actually working, I was doing my PhD, when suddenly the communist government in West Bengal and in Calcutta decided to clear the hawkers from the streets of Calcutta. There was a huge hullabaloo. It was led by now the late Minister Subhash Chakraborty. And he called this huge, this operation, I don't know whether he was being ironical, he called it Operation Sunshine. And it was quite surprising how much support he got from the bourgeoisie and from the middle classes in Calcutta, including poets, artists, painters. There's a book on this, in fact. There is a young JNU scholar whose thesis I recently read called Sukanya Mitra. Wonderful thesis which actually looks at the history of this removal of hawkers in Calcutta. I mean, so contemporary planning really. But the larger question is that what the sort of larger discourse of this removal of hawkers from Kolkata is really, I realized, was about public order. And so this is the second point I'm making. However you look at the public, it could be the public of the public sphere, it could also be what Sandra Freitag calls the public arena, or it could be the social publics, or whatever. It is always crucially linked to planning. So it's not just the planning of urban spaces, but also the regulation of the public. These two are linked. I hope this becomes more clearer as I give you some more examples. So let me do a quick recap. What is the difference between, I found, or at least this is how I look at it, So there are, I found that historians who study cities, and then there are town planning historians who study cities. And there is a difference. Historians, when they study cities, they usually study urbanization. They study demography, they study immigration, they study industrialization or the lack of it, the economy, and so on and so forth. And town planning historians usually study order, the spatial order, public order, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Now to the next point. If you look at books on planning, general books on planning, till the 1970s, and this used to puzzle me quite a bit, was that planning was called town planning. I used to wonder why. What's towns got to do with this? Because usually when we think of planning, we are really thinking of large cities, So town kahan se aa gaya? What is this got to do with it? So I started looking at the histories. Because towns suggest smaller places, and we are usually planning is usually addresses metropolises and so on and so forth. And this is what I realized, and it's quite fascinating, is that towns, planning history, the generation of planning history is closely tied to working class reform. Let's have the slide, please. Let's go to the next one. Next one. Yes, I'll just come to this. Now, if you look at Western Europe from the 19th century, it's quite interesting that the people who really started thinking about the city were often closely tied to either they were industrialists or they were labor activists or they were socialists. So the first people who actually started talking about town planning were actually socialists like Robert Owen, names we know, Charles Fourier, Etienne Cabet, Saint-Simon, etc., and the whole lot. They were always thinking. And their whole idea was that we have to get out of this congested city and build more sustainable communities, urban communities, build more sustainable, and these could well be planned. And so there were lots of plans. I don't have the sort of the pictures here, the photos here of it. They made all kinds of things. But the whole idea was that these communities, that's why they called them towns, they would be sustainable, they would be regulated, they would be healthy, they would be safe, and they would be peaceful. I want to underline this peaceful because behind the whole idea of town planning was the idea of containing class conflict. That is at the heart of town planning, all planning in fact, let me just put it. And it's very interesting. Now the apogee of this kind of thinking came with this man in the late 19th century, a man called Ebenezer Howard. He was a clerk in an office and he wrote this book, which became a huge hit, and he gave this idea of what he called the garden city. So this is one of his models for the garden city, which I want to show to you. He was very, very popular, and if you look up the Wikipedia entry on him, you will see that poets, artists, civil architects, bureaucrats, presidents, everybody became a fan. And again, his whole idea was that, what was the garden city? He said, look, why sustain cities by improving utilities? The cities are growing, you need more water, you need more electricity, you need more roads. It's impossible to actually manage all this. Let's move away, let's make a smaller area, let's make a smaller community. And if you can see this, the shape is round, but this is incidental, by the way. He didn't mean that when you build a separate working class or a separate town, it has to be round in shape. What he means is that it's self-contained. I say this because I showed this picture some time ago to somebody, and he said, this reminds me of Benthamite panopticon. Not at all. This is just the way to show that it's contained, it's small. The other thing that you can see about it is that it's green. So there will be lots of vegetation and trees, partly, as you can realize, that this was a kind of reaction to the industrial city, the squalor and the pollution and the dirt and the crowding. so you just get away. So these were the two things, and of course, Ebenezer Howard is recognized as one of the precursors of the environmental movement, by the way. So, and of course, there would be a contented working class, therefore. Of course, there is regulation in this. If you look at it very carefully, places are very carefully mapped out, who will stay where, and so on and so forth. The question you must be now asking is that, why am I telling you about this? What's this got to do with colonial planning anyway? What is the connection? Well, we are at the moment right at the heart of one of the greatest garden cities in the world, which is Lachinsis, Delhi. But what an irony. I mean, town planning was started to meet the needs of the working classes. It ended up by servicing the needs of the propertied. What an irony it is. So there is that irony at the heart of planning history also. Incidentally, Ebenezer Howard's, the first edition of his book, his second edition was called Garden Cities, but the first edition of the book was called A Peaceful Path to Social Reform. So again, it was about containing class conflict. Let's have the next slide. This is a very bad slide, but I tried to take a picture of Lachinsis roads, but we don't need to really look at this. But it's okay. Now, so Howard published a book in 1909, which is early 20th century, and it was hugely influential. But I want to go back 100 years before this, to the early part of the early decades of the 19th century, the 1800s, and explored plans and the raison d'etre of ordered spaces in colonial cities, that is in India particularly. What were the themes there? How was planning generated? How were ordered spaces, urban spaces generated in India? And there are two themes here, which I want to stress. One big theme is the body in space. Modern cities were increasingly crowded due to the new economy, obviously, the mercantile economy, for instance, in Calcutta and Bombay and in Madras. There was a concentration of modern business and industry. There was massive immigration. Crowding led to insanitation, and the relationship between bodies and spaces not only generated theories about disease, but also models for planning. How do people live in certain kinds of spaces? And here, it's very interesting, it is the rise of other kinds of knowledges and sciences that made a big impact on planning. Particularly, I'm going to choose one. There were lots of things, because there is a wonderful book on this. It is by this French historian called Alain Corbin. It's called The Foul and the Fragrant. It's a history of smells. Corbin's book is really about the rise of what he calls pneumatic chemistry. Pneumatic means air, like we have pneumatic tires or pneumatic drills. So it's about really air. And Corbin makes this argument that till the 18th century, what happened was people saw air as natural, as given. They thought it was like ether. And it's only with the rise of chemistry for the first time that it was possible to chemically analyze it. And he says when that started happening, thresholds for tolerance of smells actually started being lowered. And then he says that as a result, what happened was new kinds of spaces, particularly urban spaces, started emerging. And he says a space devoid of smells became a symbol of order and political stability, whereas a smelly space was always seen as disorderly. Other historians have also written about it. There is this Australian historian who also happens to be a doctor, incidentally, called Warwick Anderson. He calls this whole discourse, he calls it deodorization. And of course, both Anderson and Alain Corbin are both, of course, beholden to the great Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault calls it the medicalization of spaces, urban spaces, that is. And so what happened? I was looking, if you look at, say, Calcutta. Again, I'm taking an example from Calcutta because I know that best. early 19th century, when Wellesley started restructuring Calcutta, the first thing he did was he started removing cemeteries from within the city, abattoirs, tanneries, started regulating the bazaars. He started creating boulevards, open spaces, squares like the one I showed you, and of course drainage systems of drainage and water supply for clean for better living. Now that was happening. So that is how modern spaces started emerging. What is interesting also is that a new language was also forged for this. I was actually quite puzzled when and I noticed that at least the Calcutta historians haven't commented on this very much, is that if you look at the 19th century archival record, you find lots of words there. For instance, the word malaria. Now, malaria doesn't mean, by the way, the malaria we think it is. Malaria simply means bad air. So, Wellesley would say we have to get rid of malarial spaces in Calcutta. So, or the word miasma, which is putrid smell. And two other words, very interesting. One is salubrity. This is an insalubrious place, or we have to make this place salubrious. I looked at Foucault, and Foucault says actually salubrity literally means ordering and correcting spaces in the environment. That's exactly what salubrity means. There was another word that is used all the time. Again, when I first saw it, I was a bit puzzled because I thought it was a descriptive term. The word is medical police. So Wellesley says in Calcutta we should have a salutary system of medical police. I said, what on earth is medical police? I mean, of course medical police, descriptively I can know it's medicine and it's police. I didn't know this, but police in the early 19th century and in 18th century Europe meant an ensemble of functions. Again, I'm taking this from Foucault. And so police were supposed to collect taxes, they were supposed to look after the health and hygiene of the city, they were supposed to collect destitutes off the streets. In Calcutta, there was a hospital called the police hospital where all the destitutes were deposited. They were, of course, supposed to look after law and order. As things became more specialized, Foucault says that medicine and police then separated. What I'm trying to tell you is that the language was one of regulation and order also. These are not simply descriptive terms. A complementary discourse was that of cartography. Very, very important. And it's so rich. Again, I don't think Indian historians have really looked at it, partly because we have such a mulish survey of India. They'll never let you see anything. I don't know why. But, and it's interesting. I don't need to go into this. All of you know that. This has been done to that debate that, maps are not just represented, they are not empiricist enterprises. They are representations and so on and so forth. What is interesting is some of these concerns can be seen represented in the maps. Let's go to the next one, please. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, this is a map from 1820s Kolkata. This is called Schock's map. It's a very famous, very, very famous map, very detailed map. What I want to point out to you, it's not very clear, but I've taken one section of it. It clearly mentions here privies. So all the loos of Calcutta, public loos, were carefully mapped out in this map. So the idea is at some point they have to be removed. Let's go to the next one. This is a fascinating map from 1840s by Abercrombie, Lieutenant Abercrombie. Very good example of medical police. As you can see, he was a military man, but he was also in the police. He was also cleaning Kolkata. He made a plan for Kolkata. What I've done is I've actually darkened these lines so that his plan becomes important. Now, very quickly to go over the place, the actual growth of Kolkata, if you actually see, this is the river. So this is this is the west. That is the east. This is north, and this is south. So Salt Lakes is there. This is the river. Here, this is the river. So north and that's south. Now the organic growth of the city was always either west to east or east to west because the land here was higher and most of the settlement was along the banks. Guess what Abercrombie did? He wanted to make roads cutting north and south. And what was the reason? He didn't manage to do it quite at that time, but this was his plan. As you can see, the big one here, is because he wanted to flush the city. And we know Calcutta is famous for its, what in Bengali we say, Dokhin Hawa, which is the southern wind. And there are these really funny comments about from the Brits at that time saying, thank God Jog Charnak built this city to the south. What if we had built it in the north? Meaning that if the Indians had been in the south and we in the north, he said, we would have been all dead by now. So the sort of the concerns of the planners at this time was so tied to health and hygiene. That's what I wanted to really bring out. Okay, so let me go to the second theme. So one was body in space. The other logic of modern planning was what I called the dynamics of land use. Land use is a modern term. It's used by geographers. It's not there in 19th century records or anything. But it's a loaded term. It's a loaded term. Land use simply means the functional use of land. I mean, we know that. I mean, so we say residential land, commercial land, industrial land, land for entertainment, whatever, land for cinema houses, whatever you want to say. But it was a way of demarcating spaces. And the interesting thing is that people talked about mixed land use, and whenever they talked about mixed land use, say commercial and residential places where commercial and residential activities are happening together, it was usually read as traditional, pre-capitalist, backward, and disorderly. Let's have the next one. This is a very interesting slide from the 1830s of Clive Street, Kolkata. Clive Street is the heart of European Kolkata, by the way. Look at the mixed land use here. There is an old decrepit colonial building. There are some huts here. There is obviously some kind of Indian building here, which is not a hut. I mean, there's a mixed use of this place. The British hated this. What they wanted to do, transform these places into singular land use, or uniform land use. And I want to suggest that the whole thrust of planning is precisely to affirm this process, to turn mixed land use into singular land use. That was what was one of the big themes of planning histories. Now, the separation of mixed to uniform use of land was a broad secular trend in modern times. It happened because of various reasons connected to modernization, industrialization, growth of the financial sector, banking, capital flows, immigration of the laboring poor, rise of the middle classes. Capitalism needed new spaces, and the built form of cities often reflected this change. In fact, the historian Ira Katznelson talks about, drawing from Max Weber, he talks about how in the modern city in the 19th century, spaces of production started separating from the spaces of consumption. François Chouet talks about how the spaces of residence started separating from the spaces of work. Once again, planning was actually trying to affirm this, to actually put this on the ground. And the Americans actually invented a term for this late in the 19th century. It was called zoning, that we must have different kinds of zones. That was built into the plan, Now, so that means you had to contend with real estate and land in the city. And here I want to say something a bit provocative. How do you plan a city if you want to build some roads? What do you contend with? Well, the first thing is you have to acquire the land. Usually, historians, when they study the city, and the consensus is that the real power struggle was between the state and the poor. I will suggest that cities take shape because the real power struggle is between the state and the propertied. It's so difficult to actually acquire land. The state failed again and again. The last map that we saw, Abercrombie's map, that got implemented 60 years later in Kolkata. It took 2 whole generations. It was impossible to get the land. And the real power struggle, it was really full of tension. The great British historian, all of you know about him, Asa Briggs, a historian of Victorian cities. has a wonderful comment on this. He said, he doesn't quite put it in this way, this is my gloss on it, but he says the state really couldn't manage. So what did it do? It just went underground. Because it couldn't manage the city, and that's how the great drainage and sewerage systems were actually laid in the city. But even to go underground, you need the land on top of it. How do you do it? If you look at the history, again from Calcutta, when the drainage and sewerage systems were laid down, they were either laid down on roads which are already existing or in areas which were relatively easy to acquire, so therefore slums where people did not have title to land, and or, for instance, ponds in Calcutta, which was no man's land. So the state could just grab it and use it for implementing their systems of sewerage and drainage. It's very, very interesting. Okay. Now, so let's have a look at a plan. Let's have the next one. This is not very clear, but this is just a plan, by the way. This is E.P. Richards' plan for Calcutta, 1912, made for this great big institution that was set up in 1911 called the Calcutta Improvement Trust. The red lines that you see all along are these red lines, is the ideal plan. These roads actually didn't exist. What existed in Kolkata are the black ones. So he said this is how we really need to make spaces, order spaces in the city. I mean, I've written about this in some detail. There's other logic to it also, but just to. Now the reason I'm showing you this plan is that with modern plans, there are several thrusts. There's raison d'etre has, there are many, it's hydra-headed, there are many kinds of things. One was a straightforward economic logic. When you build a road, it's not as if you just build a road. There is some economic logic. And usually the economic logic is when the road is built to connect economic nodes. So say connect docks and railway stations. That's one of the usual ways to build a road. Or, in the case of Calcutta, railway station and railway station. So the most famous road built in the 1870s, 80s in Calcutta was Harrison Road, which connects Howrah station to Shialda station. Let's have the next slide, please. This is one of the first, I won't call it a boulevard really, although there's a tree there. This is Harrison Road, again from the early 20th century. It's now called, ironically, Mahatma Gandhi Road. Gandhi would quake at the thought of what this road represents, the very opposite of all his views on economy. But anyway, there it is. The other logic of planning and road building is that let's have the next slide. I'm afraid this is also not very clear. Is to unite the city economically. That is the idea that the city is fragmented spaces and it needs to be united as an pulsating economic whole. And this is a plan from 1921. It's the plan for the Calcutta Metro. Amazing, 1921. And what you can't see very well here, unfortunately, is this is the Calcutta Metro. It unites both sides of the river. Nobody had ever thought of uniting Howrah and Kolkata as one single pulsating city. So it goes under the river and goes like this. And of course it connects to the north, it connects to the south. So again, to approach the city as a economic entity. That was very, very modern. But if we look at the city like this, then it seems, I'm talking of roads and the metro and all that, because those are the public phases of planning. I mean, planning is more than just building roads. In the plans, it's in the illustrations, it's easy to see it also. But the point is that planning is not just done for economic reasons. There's no necessarily one-to-one connection. Let me quickly say this. Let's have the next slide. The thing is, planning can be done for aesthetic reasons. It can be done to affirm the past. It can be about imperial conceit. That doesn't necessarily have an economic logic. And one of the great roads made in modern India, Marine Drive, Bombay. This was finished, by the way, in the 1940s. Every time I go to Bombay, I take a taxi and go up and down the Marine Drive. It's just such a beautiful vista of the sea. I think my reading of this is this was done to turn the face of the city towards the sea, also to affirm its past, which was a mercantile past. Let's have the next one. Next slide. This is the Marina, 1880s Bombay. Madras. This was also built to turn the face of the city towards the sea, affirm its connections with the older past, the mercantile past of the city. There's no direct one-to-one logic here. This is, of course, the Madras University Senate building, built by Chisholm in the 1870s, the famous Indo-Saracenic building. And this is a rather vague picture. Now, so this was happening. Now, these themes which were generated and the planning of spaces were really brought together. So the themes of salubrity and the theme of the economy were brought together in this great planning model, which all of us are familiar with in the middle of the 19th century. Let's have the next slide. That is Haussmann in Paris. This is an interesting map. It's a 17th century map of Paris on which Haussmann's boulevards have been juxtaposed, so that you can see how much he actually did. These red lines. These purple lines are actually police stations, but the historian who uses this actually was making this larger point about not only spatial regulation, but the regulation of public order and so on and so forth. But it's very interesting. You can see he's connected both sides of the city. But of course, Haussmann, reams have been written on him, and he's usually denounced. I could do a whole lecture on Haussmann. He's so interesting. And recently, François Chouet, who I mentioned, has just published a book on Haussmann, but unfortunately it's in French. I can't read it. She's a great champion of Haussmann, by the way. But what Haussmann is really reviled for and denounced for is his vandalism. That he just drove roads through built-up areas and completely destroyed historic cores of cities, including Paris, the famous Ile de City, which was the island in the middle of the River Seine. This bit. He was, and there were all kinds of epithets used for him. Let me just. It's very funny some of the things that people used for him. He was called the Attila of the straight line. It was called Cult de la Axe, the cult of the axe, and Siegfried Gideon, the left-wing architectural historian from the 1950s, called this system, this is not a road system, it's the trench system, he said. So this is war. And one of the greatest sort of critics of Haussmann is a beautiful essay by Walter Benjamin on Haussmann and Paris, which I think many of you may have read. None of them were his admirers at all. The reason I brought Haussmann here was that I was quite surprised to see. Let's have the next slide, then I'll explain. This is Delhi, Jama Masjid, after 1857. This is, of course, one side of Jama Masjid. The parks have been laid out. This is the famous Beato photograph, of course. I was actually surprised to see that this was happening in India before Haussmann. I call this Haussmannization before Haussmann. And this kind of vandalism. And it actually created new spaces in the city. It's very, very interesting. And it seems to fit in well with an argument that modern historians make now quite frequently, which is that models of governance were first innovated in the colonies and then traveled back to the metropolis. The model of vandalism itself, which is so closely connected, I think, to town planning and to planning per se, continues. That is the interesting thing. It's not that people learn. Let's have the next slide. This is Calcutta, 1926. Just look at it. Calcutta Improvement Trust, so much has been destroyed. Just plowed through a built-up area to build this boulevard. Let's have the next slide. This is what came in its place in the 1940s. Let's go back to the previous slide. You'll just get a sense. This is where the Calcutta, you will see this big building on the left is here, and on the right there is the Statesman Office building. Let's go back again. Yeah, this is what you see. So parts of these areas were actually slums. I've worked on it, so I know. So this is what you see. This vandalism persists. Let's have the next slide. Interesting. The church I was talking about right in the beginning of my talk, that vantage point of the square which I wanted, this is St. Andrew's Church in Kolkata, next to Writers Building. If you go there, it's a very beautiful church, made the model of St. Martin's in the Fields in London. So this British planner, E.P. Richards, whom I was talking about, actually wanted to destroy this. So I call this secular vandalism. You know, he had no qualms about destroying church. It's not that he was attacking, he necessarily wanted to destroy Indian property or something. He said, get rid of this. We'll have a nice broad avenue. What is this old building doing here? But of course, planning, if I give the impression that this kind of planning, what I call housemanization before houseman, began in the 50s or began a little earlier in the colonies, and then that's not true. This kind of planning happened from the early 19th century. I have given it a name and I call it the punitive model of planning. Let's have the next slide. Next slide. This is a plan, this is a map, of course, from the 1820s Kolkata. As you can see, this is the fort, the Calcutta fort, Fort William. And this is southern Calcutta. It's confidently colored pink because it's European Calcutta or whatever. This part is North Calcutta. This is where the so-called Black Town. But the reason I'm showing you is not because of this. The reason is that what I find fascinating is this fort was built in the late 18th century, and they left this huge place, which is now called the Maidan. You know, the logic is simple. The logic is that you need straight line for fire. They had to, after Shirajuddaula had attacked and sacked Calcutta, they rebuilt. The fort was actually here somewhere. They made a new one here, and they were ready for another battle. It never happened. But what is interesting is that they did not need to leave so much space. It's 1,600 acres. It's one of the largest open spaces in the world, let me tell you. There's no other city which has this. It just defies logic, any logic, military logic, economic logic, and I say, why did they do it? Well, I don't know. I mean, the only seems to be that space here represents power. There's nothing else. Distance means power, and maybe that's how they did it. But it became a symbol of planning. And this space itself its function started changing. In the 19th century, people started calling it a lung. This is where the city breathes. So it fitted well into sort of larger notions of health and hygiene in the city. Okay. Now, let me start concluding. One question that we should ask is, what was the impact of this kind of planning? And one of the questions, and I would argue that planning always came with a cost. Financial cost, of course, social cost mostly, huge social cost. That it led to huge displacement. It led to violence. It was extremely violent. Not led to violence, it was extremely violent. And it had political consequences. Let me just explore very briefly these three things. Let me give you an example. Can I have a glass of water? There are many examples, but I will not replicate the example. But one I'll give you from Calcutta. 1926, the Calcutta Improvement Trust, which started... By the way, the Calcutta that you see today is very new Calcutta. It was only built in the early 20th century. Don't think it dates back to Job Charnock or anything. And 1926, they did a kind of count. And in 1926, they found, because of the work of the Calcutta Improvement Trust, 50,000 people had been displaced. It's a huge number. And so who got displaced? Obviously, the slum dwellers and the poor, people who had no titles to land, but also people with titles to land. but they were handsomely compensated. The thing is this, that there was no ripple. You won't find this figure in any history book on Calcutta, by the way. And here I draw on the insights of my friend Indivar Kamtekar, who is sitting right here, because he's written this essay on not Calcutta, but on Second World War, and where he mentions Calcutta, which is that there is always, we need to look at and try to understand this through the prism of class. There was no political ripple because the middle classes and the bourgeoisie actually benefited from planning. They got nicer places to stay, they were handsomely compensated, and of course the poor got nothing. So there was no hue and cry. Indivar actually points out that in Calcutta, thousands of people died on the streets of Calcutta in 1943 during the Bengal famine, but there was no political ripple. There was outrage, but no political ripple. And in 1946, when only 2,000 people died in the Calcutta riots, the Bengali Bhadralok were up in arms and wanted to partition the city. Partition the country, partition Bengal. So it's interesting, because I always used to wonder, why is it that there was no political sort of response to this? But I can give you more examples from the early 19th century as to this kind of displacement that happened. What is interesting is it's a strong word, but there is a kind of complicity of the Indian middle classes and the bourgeoisie in this kind of planning. Thank you. 5 minutes. I'll just give you an example. I find it very interesting because we always see all planning, particularly, or any colonial policy through the prisms of colonialism and nationalism. But in the middle of the 19th century, there was an Indian doctor, the first Indian doctor who actually went to England to study and came back with an English degree in medicine, called Gudiv Chakravarti. And he came back, and I can quite picture him in his three-piece suit. He comes walking, has a little chain, and he goes to the ghats of Calcutta, to Shambhajar Ghat. And he is outraged. He says, look at the people here. They're eating, shitting, bathing, burning the dead. And then he says, we really need to clean up the public places. And you know what he suggested? He said, there are these police jockeys here. Anybody who does this, just haul them up and give them a cane or two. And then these Indian publics will learn how to be clean. So there is already, it's a minor thing. It's not everybody was thinking like this, but I find it, I can give you more examples. But the point is that there is already a kind of consensus between the colonial elites and the Indian elites that we see. Okay, little bit, very, very briefly, and I'll finish in 2 more minutes. Political consequences. So what I was trying to say is that there is displacement, there is violence inherent in it. Political consequences. 2 examples, quickly. We usually see them as examples from nationalist history. I would suggest we should look at it as the history of planning. One is, of course, the famous Chapekar brothers. We remember that Chapekar brothers is when they assassinated Rand and Ayerst, but we often forget why they did it. It is when the state, in the name of planning, actually starts violating the domestic sphere. So planning begins with regulation of the public sphere, but it starts entering the Indian home. The other example that I want to give, I don't want to elaborate on this, is the Kanpur mosque incident. Soumya is here and she knows more about it. But it's interesting that Kanpur mosque incident is seen as this quote-unquote riot, but it is also a part of the planning history. They actually demolish a part to make a road. And there is this huge hue and cry about this. Maybe we can think about this. Okay, let me just, in 2 more minutes. So is this the only model of planning that we have? The answer is no. There are many critiques of the planning procedure, many critics of planning. There's a long history. Let me quickly, let's go to the next one. Next one. This is a terrible picture downloaded from this is a man called Camillo Sitte. an Austrian town planner. Some of you may have actually read about him in that very elegant book by Karl Schroske, Fond des Cycles Vienna. He rebelled against the Haussmannian plan and against sort of geometric fundamentalism. That's what he called it. Let's go to the next one. This is Ebenezer Howard, by the way, the one who made, who talked about green cities. Looks very distinguished here. Next one. Patrick Geddes here. I don't know who this Indian is. Patrick Geddes is my hero. I did a whole Teen project for 3 years on him here. Next one. Patrick Geddes' disciple, the great historian Louis Mumford. Louis Mumford said that we have to abandon the cult of the state and start talking of working with citizens and communities. Really great man. Ramboa has written very eloquently on him. There's a lovely essay on Louis Mumford. Next one. Jane Jacobs, the American historian and town planner. Lovely book, Life and Death of Great American Cities, a classic in its field. She actually she was a great champion of mixed land use. She said one of the reasons why neighborhoods are important. She was talking about crime in America, of course, and the problem. And she said because if you have mixed neighborhoods, she uses the word gaze, and this is not the postmodern gaze, but she says there is always a gaze. There is a friendly gaze of the shopkeeper, of the matron, of the retired uncle, and these places are safe. We have to have more mixed land use in cities. The old history of American cities is of singular land use. She was a great writer. And next one. This is my favorite historian, Richard Cobb. He's not a town planning historian, but if you read his histories, he does talk about the small grain of cities so beautifully, especially a revolutionary Paris. I've learned... Not Richard Sennett, Richard Cobb. Yes, it's not Sennett at all. No, Sennett is not my hero. It's Richard Cobb. Okay. But this is a different strand of planning history. And it's another story. And I'll just end here, I think.